Good afternoon, and thank you for everybody coming. This is the first monthly lecture for 2019, so it's really my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. And this is our colleague, one of the permanent fellows of the Institute, Miloš. So the reason you're here is not because you don't know who he is, but because you know. So from this point of view, I'm going to save you some of my pronunciation of German titles and others. But there are four things that I want basically to say as the introduction. As you know, Miloš is a professor of law in the Vienna University. He was the senior Hauser Fellow in NYU Law School, one of the most kind of respectable and famous law school in the world. He was with the Wissenschaftskolleg. But for us, it's critically important that we basically this year are planning two of the permanent fellows to give their lectures, because for us it's also very important for all of you who are coming to the Institute also to get an idea about the interdisciplinary nature of the Institute. And from this point of view, Miloš is great because of his broadness of interests. As somebody who is not coming from law, I do believe it's critically important also to judge academically people of how good they are when they're discussing other people's projects. So from this point of view, this is really a great pleasure to introduce him. And he's going to talk about a topic which I found particularly relevant to some of the problems that the world is facing today, comparing with new technologies and how basically we're going to regulate the social life. He's going to talk about historically how certain lawyers failed to civilize war. And this kind of interconnection between legal norms, morality, social customs and practices, I do believe was at the center of his interest in general. And seeing the outlines of his lecture, you can see how seriously he was approaching all of us. So in the hope of a very interesting discussion, Miloš, please, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Ivan. Many thanks, dear friends and colleagues, for coming. So this is my talk tonight about international lawyers failing, and I have put this image about World War I warfare at the very beginning. You may have your own imagination of what pariah weapons, weapons that should be morally and legally outlawed, are. Historically, it is also in this picture, you can see some faces with a gas mask, and poison gas was one of the icons of modern technology that was banned several times, but finally these bans failed when it came to the first attack at Ypres in 1915. So there are nicer pictures of World War I and chemical warfare, but the 20th century has expanded our imagination what pariah weapons might be. I'm not talking about the 20th century. My story is mainly about the history of legal doctrine, of state practice, customary international law, and as Ivan already mentioned, these normative orders are entangled with morality, moral theology very often, social custom, and also something like military honor. I will come back to this. So I'm talking about these pariah weapons, and my interest is why are some weapons regarded as intrinsically evil, which narratives were employed to justify banning certain weapons, what were the purposes of such bans, and finally, did these restrictions really humanize or maybe even legitimize warfare before World War I? This period in the center of my talk are the last decades of the 19th century. It is a very important period for the history of the law of war. modern, we would say now, modern international humanitarian law emerges, but at that time it was labeled as the law of war. Studied with much enthusiasm, as eminent international legal historian Martti Koskeniemi says, and the project of these lawyers and also from the so-called civilized states was to humanize warfare. And my thesis is that this is somehow a failed moralization of law. So I'm talking about the so-called pariah weapons, weapons that are singled out, treated as a taboo. I'm part of a research group at Meiji University in Tokyo. They are interested in the history of global arms transfer, and I will come back to the contemporary background of their political, so to say, interest that drives their historical research later on. There is a problem when we are talking about pariah weapons. It's an anachronism, so you don't find this label in the sources. But still, I think there are some functional analogies looking at weapons and the discourse about weapons. And another important thing is when I'm talking today about weapons, this is only about artifacts. It is not about military strategies. This is important to say because historically in the sources, if you look at people like Immanuel Kant or so, they were often combining the discourse about strategies and weapons together. I will give you some evidence of this. So it's about devices, munitions, implement a substance, an object, or a piece of equipment when I'm talking about weapons. These weapons are regarded as intrinsically evil weapons, mala in se, and the people discussing these weapons and trying to implement rules are, in my perspective, the Invisible College of International Lawyers. This is a title, very catchy title of a contribution many years ago. And I'm putting them in the center because there is very little treaty law before the end of the 19th century. Customary law is also a problem. So mainly international lawyers, also political scientists, theologians and Staatswissenschaftler, as you say in German, they are promoting this idea that you should ban certain types of weapons. Okay, but this group of people is sometimes also visible. So this is the cover of Harpers Weekly, displaying the eminent lawyers of the late decades of the 19th century. So I would say this is a quite homogeneous group. They are, so to say, European, male, white men, and they have certain ideas which are very important about what civilization, progress is and what it demands in terms of norms. And their project is to contribute to this European civilization, and they are talking a lot about their supreme civilization and the counterpart, the barbarians on other continents and warfare of barbarians. I will come back to this later on. So they are trying to promote something like a taboo, that there are certain weapons which should never ever be used, not only in certain situations, not only against like civilians or so, but some weapons are absolutely prohibited. And this taboo is seen as a narrative, and it serves as a narrative, as my colleague Michelle Bentley says. The use is immoral, weapons should be eliminated, and violators have to be punished. I'm talking about law, but law is very often entangled. It's entangled with other laws. So international law is very often emerging from domestic provisions. If you think about the case of poison gas, you can clearly see that there are analogous provisions in national criminal codes. If you use poison, this is something terribly bad. And you will be punished very heavily compared to other methods of violating others. So domestic legal systems are in dialogue with international law, but I found it also very important to expand beyond the legal sphere, and my label for this is multi-normativity as an analytical framework, because I have the theory and the assumption that these international legal provisions are in a very complex and complicated dialogue with ethics, morality, religion, and also social customs. So if you think about military conventions, martial honor or military honor, these people, the soldiers, the military, they have their own idea which weapons are, so to say, okay to be used. And finally, if we think about the late 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, also technological standards might have an impact on the construction of these pariah weapons. My claim is that this is nothing exceptional, but you can find this combination, this interaction of different normative spheres in every social field. So if you look, like I have written in the IWM post an article about shaking hands, and it's a very complex issue. You know, we had these big debates throughout Europe about people refusing to shake hands, and you will see also in this field how moral, religious, and legal standards say what is okay, what is not okay, and so on. So it's something very regular, something very typical, first of all, for every field of interaction. And it is also very important to say that these different normative provisions, regulations, are very often, not very often, I'm not sure about that, but sometimes they are tensions. They are not saying the very same thing, but they are tensions, so morality is not exactly saying the same as international law, or military honor codes have their own account what is correct. So conformance does not always arise between different normative orders. Ivan already said we are discussing the issue of outlawing weapons in an age of accelerated technological progress. The pace of technological change has quickened. If you look at the last years and decades, there is a long list I could read to you about these weapons, but I mean, it's nearly at a daily scale in the news. If you think about cyber warfare, if you think about these missiles, automatic weapons, and so on. So there is technological change asking also for our normative assessment what is correct. And we all know that warfare in general has changed. 2 years ago, we had a conference here about the human condition and the new wars with Mary Calder, and we were discussing how warfare in general is shifting away from the idea of the dichotomy of war and peace. So we are talking about attacks, terrorism, intervention, and so on. So it's not very clear what's actually happening. These weapons are also expanding the possibilities of organized violence, and they're blurring the lines of combatants and non-combatants, war and peace. And again, poison comes in very, very complicated ways in these military conflicts against civilians, against combatants, and so on. I'm starting with an epoch which is, so to say, before international humanitarian law is introduced. And this is very important to say. International humanitarian law is a so-called neologism. This is the year 2000. This is the year 1900. This is 1800. So you don't have any language of international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law is something pretty recent. So historically, we were in general talking about the law of war. And I mean, it's very obvious, but this shift in language always is expressing a shift of perception. Something is happening, and therefore we have this new language, and it means we have new theories, new phenomena, which we are framing with the terms. As I already said, I'm talking about the international lawyers as actors and people who are promoting norms, who are imposing norms in their books, because there are very few treaties up until the late 19th century regulating banning weapons. So in some treaties you have disarmament, but it is not against particular weapons in general. There is no such treaty. If you know one, please let me know. This would be a breakthrough for me, or maybe it would destroy my theory, but I have not encountered any such treaty. The very few treaties about weapons have very limited scopes of application. So sometimes you have disarmament between parties, but no general interdiction of a certain type of weapons. And Georg Friedrich von Martens from Göttingen says that these conventions extend no further than the war for which they are made. So no general outlaw weapons at that time. And only the Hague conferences aimed to codify the law of war and the usage of weapons. And they are outlawing some weapons. I will come back later to this. It was absent in the 19th century. So the jurists instead were deliberating on restrictions in their law books, in their textbooks, establishing international legal standards. And these textbooks, they are very, very interesting. I love them because they are written in a very normative fashion. So if you look at these textbooks from the law of nature and nations tradition, you can see that they are presenting their statements starting with a paragraph icon or sign. So it reads like a code. And it's not very clear. So the source is somehow reason or nature or God's will or so, but their arguments are very often presented in a very normative fashion. It is like that. You should not, and so on. So the textbooks are designed like neutral legal codes. There are many disciplines contributing to that discourse. Natural law is a thing in itself, so to say, theology, political science, and moral philosophy. So the jurists are not the only ones writing about the law of war and what to do and not to do. But finally, they will take the helmet and push the others back. Sometimes it's not very clear what the exact normative foundation for banning certain weapons is. They are just saying, this is not okay, full stop. No more explanation. There is one issue which is, in fact, more problematic than I thought when I started this research. So I put a question mark here. I assumed everybody is totally fine with limiting war. Yes, but. So the first literary genre is this law of nature and of nations tradition. Long-lasting traditions were established. That's why I'm presenting some of these authors, the most three famous from pre-modern legal, philosophical, political writing, Hugo Grotius, Emer de Vattel, and Immanuel Kant. They have a very strong impact, long-lasting impact. They are frequently quoted, usually very affirmative quotes, even in the 19th century and beyond. It's not history, it's still a normative claim which goes along with that quotation. And it is very clear already if you look at that type of argumentation also in the 19th century, that this 19th century international law is not an entirely positive enterprise. There is a so-called positive myth, I think. They all believe in God's will and the higher things, and there is a lot behind positive regulations. So law of nature remained influential. And the first quote comes, as you may assume, from Hugo Grotius of the Law of War and Peace, first published in 1625. And this is from the first English edition of 1655. And there is a big problem in that quote, and I put it into brackets. So he says in that English translation, dangers which are very common in war should not be multiplied beyond measure. And I think the translator forgot the not. If you look at later editions, it's just the opposite. So there is always a not, and this is just a wrong translation. But it is very clear with Hugo Grotius, there are limits, and he is trying to outlaw perfidies. And this is exactly the case with poison. So poison is something very, very bad, and it's about disgrace and infamy. Also, Emer de Vattel, Swiss, writing in French, very elegant, lot of translations, lot of additions, annotations, and so on. And he says pretty much the same. Against assassination, poisoning are contrary to the law of war and consent of all civilized nations that this should not happen. The practice is prohibited by the law of nature, and again the same argument with Grotius. Law of nature does not allow us to multiply the evils of war beyond all bounds. So there are bounds in warfare, and poisoning is exactly beyond that boundary. Immanuel Kant adds a very interesting argument. This banning of poison and treachery is about mutual confidence in international relation, because it makes confidence impossible in a subsequent state of peace. So assassins, poisoners, breaches of capitulation, and make use of treachery are forbidden. And he says these are dishonorable stratagems, and so on. So when I approached this subject, I assumed there is a consent about this, but surprisingly, it is not. So the summary would be certain weapons are morally unacceptable. If you look at Hugo Grotius, there is a broad foundation with biblical sources, with history and theology, and moral theology is, so to say, included in jurisprudence in the legal sphere. It gives a fundament, and there is a strong moral language against poisoning, which comes into international law or law of nations, which would be the term at that time. And these early forms of pariah arms remain deeply enshrined in national civil law codes today. And very often we refer to these pariah weapons also in art and popular culture, but I skip this. Okay, so here Hagen kills Siegfried, and it's treacherous, and here you have an Austrian woman poisoning their victims, so there is a local reference here. Okay, and it can also be fun if you look at that. Okay, but now I come to something which surprised me when I first read the sources. So there are people who claim exactly the opposite. And this is this Dutch lawyer Cornelius van Binkershoek. He wrote in 1737, a treatise on the law of war, which was even reprinted, translated and reprinted in the United States in 1810. And he claims that war is a contest by force and says clearly every force is lawful in war. And generosity is altogether a voluntary act that leaves us at liberty to destroy an enemy by every possible means. No boundaries in war, only voluntary restrictions. And Christian Wolff, very famous natural law philosopher, a lot of disciples in the 18th century German legal and philosophical university sphere, says very much the same. If you would ask me about the percentage, I would say this is a 5% minority. The others are like 95% of the discourse. I'm jumping directly to the end of the 18th century, and I try to highlight some continuities and discontinuities. So the textbooks of international law are shifting to new legal sources. They are putting treaties and custom into the titles of their textbooks. So the textbooks are the law of nations founded on treaties and sources. So this may support that there is a turn towards positivism. And because they are looking at treaties and custom, and these treaties are concluded among mainly European states, there is also a shift to a language of not a universal or law of nations or international law, but it is now a European law of nations. So the 19th century comes up with a whole tradition and a whole shelf with books which are saying European law of nature and of nations, or European law of nations, finally, front and center. And the debate of the law of war and weapon continues. And again, it's the very same line of argumentation. We should diminish the horror of wars. It's against sound polity, it's unlawful, and it's against morality. And what's happening here, that there is the same line of arguments about identifying criteria to outlaw, or first, so to say, to judge political or military behavior, often by giving examples. These examples should guide combatants in the midst of the fight. And the jurists are very often writing about utility in case of conflict. So the measures of war should comply with utility. And they had this idea, this notion of utility had a double function. First of all, it was enabling the use of force, because you are allowed to use weapons or measures which are useful, and at the same time utility is limiting the criterion of utility is limiting the method of warfare. And now be prepared for a big surprise. In case of extreme military necessity, there are no rules. So if you are in big trouble, no rules apply. And interestingly, this is a very unanimous doctrinal figure. Even with the international lawyers, they say in case of extreme necessity, there is no law of war. Okay, so utility and military necessity are in a very complex relation to each other. The 19th century brings a lot of language about progress, dramatic changes in the law of war. You all know this Hegelian language about progress. We had this yesterday also, and the international lawyers are absolutely part of that discourse. They are, and now comes the dark side of their language of progress and European standards and civilization. There is a dark side. They're absolutely ignoring the detrimental effects of empire and colonialism, and they are supporting empire and colonialism with their writings and their doctrinal figures. The 19th century brings a lot of technological, scientific progress, and this progress is fueling also treaty making and declarations, and there are step by step, there is an increase not only about regulation of technology and economy, but also about the law of war. And it starts, I think, with the St. Petersburg Declaration, and this says there is a progress of civilization and we should not aggravate the sufferings, and there are the laws of humanity and they're restricting warfare. This is continued by the Brussels Declaration on Land Warfare of 1874, and there is a principle. I may briefly say principles are not the very same as rules. These are, so to say, guidelines, and the guideline is the means of injuring the enemy are not unlimited, and therefore in the Brussels Declaration on Land Warfare, employment of poison and poisoned weapons is explicitly forbidden. This, with some steps, goes into the Hague Convention on Land Warfare of 1899-1907, and it says, beside the prohibitions provided by special conventions, it is especially prohibited to employ poison or poisoned arms, or to employ arms, projectiles, or material of a nature to cause superfluous injury. So there is again the idea of utility and proportionality. Finally, there is also the Martens Clause. This is a very fascinating legal product. It is referring to the laws of humanity and the requirements of the public conscience in case there are cases not included. So here, positive law is referring to non-positivist standards, morality, public opinion, public conscience. So this is a very flexible thing, and it's about the European self-assessment of progress and civilization, and this will carry on even if we don't know at the moment what will happen in future. There will be a better international law, and please, let's comply with this. It's a very complicated construction, so to say. It's very optimistic, but it's very vague. So there is a lot to interpret and to discuss in that clause. Colleagues have written about that, and they claim that here in this clause, the existence and import of the patently non-positivistic sources of international humanitarian law is addressed. And the assumption is in that clause, international humanitarian law is incomplete and war is subordinate to law. And again, here in that clause, you find this idea of multi-normativity. Norms of morality may serve as supplements to law. And again, Europe as a moral, political sphere is evoked. There is the European conscience. So the Hague Conventions did not want to revolutionize international humanitarian law. They had only the ambition to codify international customary law. And if you look at the provisions, you see clearly that they are, in terms of content, in full line with the previous statements of these eminent international lawyers, Grotius, Vattel, Immanuel Kant. So it's against poison. Poison is always the most prominent example for also unnecessary suffering and needless injury. And if you look at these writings, I mean, there is a lot of international law writing in the years around 1900. The catalogs become longer and longer, how to identify that type of weapons. More and more terms and concepts are created to describe moral and legal duties of civilized states. So the canon of topoi is growing, but some topoi are vanishing. I skipped that in favor of time and discussion. The audience, again, probably it's to address combatants and non-combatants, but you know, the international lawyers are always also writing for their colleagues and try to impress, and so. So it's a discourse, and if you look, I mean, this is a very amateur graphic attempt to fix this together, but if you look at the criteria, you will find all those words when they are describing legitimate and illegitimate strategies of warfare and weapons. So honesty, unehrenhaft, odious, and so on and so on. So there is a full spectrum, so to say, of yardsticks which they are employing to discuss things and to outlaw weapons. Now it's getting very delicate because all these international lawyers are absolutely in favor of humanity, civilization, high moral standards. So what is wrong with that? A lot. Because their self-assessment is very problematic, it's very Eurocentric, and their self-perceptions are biased. So if you look at their self-assessment, they are constantly evoking the period of humanitarian progress and voluntary codification. And this civilization was, of course, European. It was Christian at its core. And this has also strong impacts in the law of war. The counter idea and what they are fighting are barbarian types and methods of war, which are stigmatized. And who are the barbarians? They are the people outside of Europe. They are accused of savagely poisoning their enemies. So it's not only about history of earlier European epochs, eras, medieval and ancient things, but it's a contemporary thing they're addressing. And also colonialism goes so far that they are claiming one thing that should never be allowed is the use of colonial troops. These are barbarians, and this is against the standards of the law of war. The employment of savage allies is a frequent topic. And interestingly, they're very open with that discussion. So Henry Wheaton, the most important American international lawyer of the 19th century, says the public law is limited to the civilized and Christian people of Europe or those of European origin. Okay, I will come back to the impact in a second, but there is also another story of not only a language of progress, but there is real progress, so to say, in weapon technology. So there is regulatory challenges through industrialization and militarization, rockets, mines, chemical compounds, torpedoes, in the early 20th century, flamethrowers, submarines, machine guns, aerial bombardments, and tanks. So if you look at the beginning of the 20th century, at the provisions and what the earlier writers were stating, it looks very often outdated because technological progress is running fast. So this is Congreve rockets exploding already in 1831, one thing that was discussed as a weapon to be outlawed. International lawyers had a very positive attitude towards technology. They thought, with many other political writers and colleagues, that new weapons are progress. And they are a fantastic thing because future wars would be much shorter and they would be much more effective, and that technology would save life. So technology was in principle not seen as a threat but as a promise for civilizing and making warfare more humanitarian. So there is hope. They projected on the technology progress, and new weapons would promote peace. There was a clear promise of technology. More destructive weapons would lead to fewer future wars. So the international lawyers were very often not only Darwinistic, racist, imperialistic, but they were always also writing as militarists in a very belligerent spirit. So the idea of restricting new weapons seemed not very patriotic, so they were very hesitant to label many of these new weapons as something bad. So what was the outcome of this language of humanity and humanization of warfare? Actually, very little. James Lorimer, a Scottish international lawyer, said, this has all no value. Few weapons were outlawed. It's basically dum-dum bullets and poison gas. The restrictions were at least not intentionally imposed to justify warfare as a whole. But we have to be aware that this international pre-World War I law, international law, was not only supporting humanity, progress, civilization, but it actively contributed by justifying violence to warfare. It was normalizing and legitimizing the use of force in the most terrible way in the colonies, but also on the European continent. And even the restrictions existing were very poorly implemented on the battlefield. This is something which we don't know in detail, but that would be very interesting to know more exactly. So World War I, as you know, brought many of these weapons on the battlefields. To sum up the mood before August 1914, the international lawyers, everybody was very optimistic about international law. They were very enthusiastic about writing about the progress also of international law. International treaty making was very popular, and new developments seemed to be very promising. There was this belief in human progress. But would these legal provisions really hold up in times of war? Lasse Oppenheim, German, British, Jewish lawyer, said yes. And his example is poisoning, the worst thing. This is so outlawed, this would not happen. As you all know, this is Ypres in 2015. In Ypres in 1915, the Germans used at the Western Front poison gas. They killed thousands. This is an incident without precedents, and it was brought by chemical innovations. Fritz Haber, the later Nobel Prize winner for chemistry in 1919, was developing this, and he was offering to the military this fantastic weapon, a lot of promises and so on. Okay, so World War I saw these weapons, even the worst outlawed weapons, in action. Injured soldiers after the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. This is the masterpiece gassed by John Singer Sargent of 1919. And there is also a moral argument behind these paintings. This is not only for illustration and to entertain you. Because if you look at the writings and the paintings after and during World War I, there is a lot of justification of modern technologies. Think about the Italian futurists, these movements, and philosophers and authors. They were very enthusiastic about war and new technologies. But never anybody about the case of poison gas. So if you look at the illustrations, representations, images, and stories of warfare, poison gas is always something very bad and negative. So there was still this stigma. It was outlawed, but the military used it, and it was justified with military necessity and reprisals. So during World War I, the tone of publications changed. Everybody blamed the others, the enemy of destructing international law. International law was denied very often. Limits of declaration and treaties were highlighted. International law is not binding anymore. This clause is not binding, etc. And there was a very strong disappointment about that the intrinsically evil weapons prohibition would not persist against technological, military, and power narratives. Moralizing international law showed here its dark side, so to say, because the argumentation that international law is a very moral legal order was now pulled out against all the others, all the enemies. Everybody says we are morally on the right side. This is extremely military necessity. We are fighting in favor of civilization, in favor of, Darwinistic, colonialistic justifications came in, and they were pulled out not against the savages in Africa or somewhere else in the world, but against the other European powers. So there was an inbuilt problem that appeared after 1914. And I'm coming to my end. As you all know, after World War I, there was a period of reassessment leading to the conclusion that certain weapons should definitely be outlawed again. So this is the Geneva Protocol of 1925 against poison gas again, but also war itself needed to be outlawed. The Briand-Kellogg Treaty of 1928, having last year its 100-year celebration. Okay, I stop here. I try to finish in time, and I'm looking forward to your questions, remarks, and discussion. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. It was a great presentation, and this is why I'm going to basically use the fact that I'm a moderator to start with the first two questions. And for me, the biggest question is why poison? Because normally you can go with two different types of, if you go backwards from our point of view, what kind of weapons you are trying to outlaw now? Those who had a maximum damage. It's not poison. Then, and secondly, it's about cruelty. The famous liberalism of fear and so on, that cruelty. And I'm asking this because you touched on something that in my view is extremely interesting. Who was using poison? During the colonial wars, in a certain way, colonial powers are coming with a firepower. The Native Americans have been much more using poisonous weapons. The second problem about poison, my question is, to what extent this was not a court weapon? The class court weapon. Basically, you're poisoning kings. You're not poisoning villagers. So this is why I'm very much interested. And here comes something very important, and this is the popular culture. Why certain type of weapons capture the imagination of these jurists? And my second question is, which is kind of outside of the presentation, but what struck me is that if before World War I, normally you're trying to ban and outlaw the type of weapons that you know. At the end of the 20th century, 21st, basically you try to ban the weapons that you don't know. In a certain way, the weapons that have not been used yet. If you're trying to see what basically you're trying to do it, and so on and so on. So this is my question is first, why poison? And the second, do you believe that there is this kind of a jump because of technological development? Can you ban a weapon that have never been used, is the second question.
Reading the sources, I'm trying to be a good historian, I first of all would underline their arguments. So there is something about infamous, treacherous weapons, and poison is it. And that is where I think military honor codes come into play. So there is the idea of an open fight, man against man. And poison, as you might have guessed from the images, it is also a feminine weapon. So there is something about also, there is a gender ideology behind it. And this brings, again, a particular type of morality into argumentation. So this is one line, military honor codes. And the other thing is, there is this also what you highlighted, there is this idea of the prince being particularly threatened by that type of weapon, which is a very long tradition. And it is, I think Richard Price wrote this in an article, poison is, so to say, the big equalizer. Everybody can be victim of this poison attack. And so kings and jurists writing some kind of legal theory in favor of warfare, protecting kings, are very much against it. But interestingly, this strand of argumentation ceases. So if you look at the justifications in the late 19th century from the jurists, they are writing libraries about these infamous weapons, treacherous weapons. This monarchical argument is totally silent. You don't see it anymore. Still, maybe as an undercurrent, it might exist. So there is a lot about, treacherous, deceit, weapons, and this idea of military honor being a very dominant moral pattern and justification narrative for fighting of the military. And that is my theory also, why there is, and this is an additional information, there is no open discourse during World War I about the use of poisonous weapons on both sides, interestingly. So international law is flourishing, so to say, during World War I because they're discussing submarines, machine guns, flamethrowers. But the military is silent about their use of poison gas because there is some kind of odious using that. Even the Austrians winning the 12th battle at the Isonzo by poison gas, they are not publicly speaking about that. And Karl Kraus is making nasty remarks in his Die letzten Tage der Menschheit. I don't recall the exact quote here. Okay, so that would be my answer to your first question. And the second is, well, I'm not convinced when they were discussing in the late 19th century that they were aiming at future technologies. They are very hesitant. They are only thinking in terms of what we are having. And in the last years of the 19th century, and probably until April 22nd of 1915, there is no imagination that they would ever have such a weapon as poison gas. That was beyond technological progress imagination. So they are talking about, very concrete things, dum-dum bullets, which appear to be terrible. And the machine gun is also for a very little moment inside of discussion, and flamethrowers, submarines. But only the existing weapons are a topic. And this type of military technology law is not aiming at future weapons. And if they would, I would claim they would be in favor of enabling, not repressing, because they were very fond of technological progress. And that was the big promise: peace through military progress, better wars, more effective wars, shortening the war, less victims.
Thank you very much. Please, anybody who is interested, comments, questions?
So let me start, please. Miloš, I tried to sum up a bit of the like general tension of your talk that you've outlined very, very nicely from the very beginning. You spoke about the bans failing. That's what you mentioned in the beginning, and you also have it in the title, the imperfect project. You call it the lawyers failing. I would just like to know to what degree is this not just an empirical failure, but to what degree is this a systemic failure? You quoted this very nice sentence, this declaration saying, wage war in a civilized way. Obviously, and this, I mean, you brought it out very nicely, so this is not a surprise to you, but obviously one could hold that war per se is an uncivilized undertaking, so norms have been suspended from the very beginning. And with that, I do not mean to take over the position of the Dutchman Cornelius Bunkershoek that you referred to, who said that every force is lawful in war. But I would hold that obviously the use of every force has a high seductive power in every war. And you also quoted this other example of when the necessity is that big, then every force may be used in war. So that brings me to the question: to what degree is this a systematic failure, and to what degree do you see it as an empirical failure? And just one example, and maybe also linking up to the example that Ivan gave with the use of poison gas in the First World War, I would also want to ask to what degree this is not just a question of norms and of law, but also of like a general reception of law and a public attention to it and a public opinion. Because if you think of this example of the First World War, I would say, obviously, what the Germans caused was a humanitarian disaster, but what they caused in 1915 was also a PR disaster. And this PR disaster, I mean, they have lost, in some sense you can say they lost the war in 1915 with the invasion of Belgium and the pictures that were sent around the world. And interestingly, it was not only the pictures of people dying because of poison gas, but other things like the destruction of the library of Leuven, for example, that became a totally iconic image for that, the German barbarians. Yeah? And in some sense one could say this destruction of the library was a bigger PR disaster than maybe the use of poison gas.
I would agree. And I have a specific argument why I would agree in particular, because the poison case was not brought to the public to that extent. The other European powers were just curious and eager to imitate the Germans very soon. So they tried to develop also poison gas as a weapon that they could use. And then they pulled out the same justification, military necessity and reprisal, as the German did. But they were pretty silent about that. That is the interesting thing. So both sides remain very hesitant to argue with these doctrinal figures from international law, because even the military thought there is something wrong about the use of poison. It does not comply with our own moral standards, and even if there is such a thing as military utility, to justify it, there is something still odious. So I would say you're totally right, but the real PR disaster was, like you said, Leuven library, and particularly the violation of the neutrality. And Bethmann Hollweg was so stupid to state that in front of the German Reichstag. We are now in the case of self-defense, and there is now the moment to take action. And then famously he added the sentence, Not kennt kein Gebot. So in case of necessity, there is no international law. So we have here the explicit denial of international law. And now the international lawyers or international legal historians are debating in how far this is a particular German mindset. I mean, Germany was some kind, partially of a military dictatorship, and the British were very clever in promoting, we are fighting this war for international law. But at the same time, you can also find within British and French textbooks the idea of military necessity outlawing international law of war. So this is a very complicated thing. There is also a very strong tradition in other countries with this idea of a military necessity, putting away any legal restraints of war, any humanitarian things. And if I may say, also in this moment, there were whole continents beyond the sphere of the law of war because they were not seen as civilized political entities. They were not perceived as states. And if you are not a state, you're not a subject to the law of war, and barbarian warfare is attributed to them, and it is justified for your own military measures. So very complicated. And your first question is very interesting. And what is, I think, the difference between the late 19th century self-perception of the international lawyers and what we would say what they really did. And this is why I say that there were, in fact, some inbuilt problems in the doctrine of international law of war, like the idea that fight the barbarians, fight the others, fight war in the name of progress, humanity, mitigate the war, and if you have this justification narrative, you are entitled to beat the enemy, very powerful, very much without any restrictions. And this turned in 1914, in 1915, 16 and 17 against the other Europeans that were previously seen as civilized peoples and political entities. So I think, and some other international legal historians, Oliver Digelmann, Johann von Bernstorff, they were publishing in the last years papers and articles stating very clearly that this is, so to say, not a side effect, but it was an inbuilt problem with the justification of the exercise colonialist legitimations of warfare, first against the others, but then the Europeans, so to say, also became the others.
Thank you, Miloš, very much. That was really mind-blowing for those of us who are lay people in the field of history, of law. So I have sort of two lay questions for you. One is, to put it very simply, is this a losing battle for law when you remind oneself of the simple saying that might is right? And that, as you've been saying in answering your questions, that when the time comes in the need for efficiency, simply everything that has been written down is forgotten. And, you know, one can take the kind of present 20th century, which you don't look into, but I'm sure that you will, of the use of the atom bomb over Japan. It's, as we know, the Americans make a calculation. Given the price of the victory in Okinawa, where tens of thousands of American soldiers died, they extrapolate and they say, if we invade Hokkaido, the island where Tokyo is, we will have X. And so it's better that we throw the bomb and then, in the name of saving lives, of efficiency, we use an unacceptable weapon. The same we can question today for the use of depleted uranium. Is that, you know, where does that fall? Is that poison or not? So that's the question, you know, is this a losing battle, and is law trying to catch up or to codify something that in the end is impossible to legify? And finally, just a question, is the use of the term just and unjust war anyway pertinent to this subject? Thank you.
That's a very complicated second question. I start with the first. To say it paradoxically, you can learn from history that you can't learn from history. Because, I mean, you're totally right with your examples, but at the same time you could claim after World War I, there was very little use of poison gas in the next decades. I mean, there were incidents, think about the Italians in Ethiopia in the 1930s, but not on a broad scale during World War II. It's very complicated to say why the European and the global powers did not use poison gas. They had it, and still they refrained from it. Maybe it was because of military constellations, strategic discussions, a transport problem, the danger of harming your own, etc. So there are many potential reasons, but still, I mean, you could also say, so 1925, the Geneva Protocol says it's an absolute forbidden weapon in no situation, and for most of the rest of the 20th century, most powers of the world refrained from it. With exceptions, very important exceptions. Think about the Iraq-Iran war, also Syria in the last years and so on. But still, on a big scale, please? And Vietnam also. I mean, we have still these cases in American courts where people are suing governments and chemical plants for supplying that. So it's still a legal issue. And the question is also how far the atomic bomb would also be a weapon under, okay. But, and also you could say the same thing for the atomic bomb, because as you know, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no further use of it. So there was some kind of a stigmatization, and if you look at the language of the discourse on atomic weapons, so there is a very strong moral arguments against it. The commemoration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is loaded with religious, theological language, and all these moral terminology comes up. So there is a strong memory of disappointment, which is, so to say, fueling today's political action, and it is a never again, not only in the case of poison, but also in case of atomic bombs. And many projects of peace activists and so on, they are taking their political legitimation for their fight against certain pariah weapons like landmines, automatic weapons, from these historical examples. And actually, to confess this here, I was wondering, so to say, what the Tokyo project is fueled by and what their use of history would be in that contemporary Japanese political context. As we all know, I mean, peace activism in Japan is very strong, and it has its root in the historical experience of the use of such weapons, of militarism and military dictatorship, leading to certain decisions and not having a civil society discourse, which is very analogous to the German Kaiserreich, which also led to a very strong dominance of the military caste, just saying, okay, we have that problem and we will have a military solution. Neutrality does not play a role. And here comes the famous quote, the treaty is just a scrap of paper. Let's go through Belgium and Luxembourg, and there is an excuse for it. We are in the position of a military necessity, and international law is not that important. And somehow, if you look at the discourse in the later years, peace activism, liberal international lawyers and so on, they are trying to rethink international law, pre-World War I international law, and also when we are rethinking as international legal historians, not only these late 19th century international law, but also the law of colonialism of the 16th and 19th century. We're trying to make something out of that morally depressing legal experiences.
Very much.
2 mics. I don't need 2. I have 2 questions, but I don't need 2 mics. So thank you, Miloš. But what I was surprised by was your entire omission of the whole TWAIL scholarship, the third world approaches to international law, for the last 25 years has been one of the most fundamental critiques of international law. So just not the international law of war, but the whole framing of international law as a project, as being deeply implicated in imperialism. And therefore, anything which you have said today would just be part of a critique which would show that the whole categorization of what is civilization, what is barbarian, etc. So it's not about Eurocentrism of a particular framing of a law, but that entire project of international law, starting with Grotius, etc. Someone like Anthony Angie's work, for example, would be seminal to it. Sandhya Pahuja's work in Melbourne would be absolutely crucial. Upendra Bakshi, Ghai, I mean, I can think of so many of them whose entire project of the TWAIL is conceived of as a critique of all the fundamental categories of international law as suffused with exactly this kind of a binary of defining the Western project as a civilized project, which is a legal project. The other, not only just because they don't have states, but they are actually not quite human. And therefore, they are not even objects of a war. So you can kill them by any means because you just don't declare war on them. So therefore, of course, no international law would apply to them in that relationship. So I think that's something which one would need to factor in as the larger framework for making this argument. The second question is a more immediate one, in the sense of the case that I'm thinking of is the banning of landmines. That would be the most successful banning of a weapon in the last few years, and one that has had some effect in the way it's been implemented, etc. So interestingly, in that case, it is also, for me, what I found interesting in your title already, you see this as a lawyer's failing, but in fact, international lawyers hardly played any role in the banning of landmines, so that it was, in a sense, a transnational civil society coalition, which for years pressed for the banning of landmines, but the argument was a very different one. So it's not poison, it's not the king, it's not heimtückisch or odious, but it is civilian injuries. So it's about taking a weapon whose ambit is therefore outside of the war theater. And but nevertheless, military honor, which you would think would be a justification, saying what kind of military honor is this, that you kill and maim children? This was not part of the argument that was used in any case, but it was to say that the effects of war should be limited such that you limit two kinds of its effects. One, its temporal effect, so you can end a war and the landmines will still kill for the next 20 years. And secondly, the scope of the injuries going much beyond a battlefield. So it's not like a combatant injury at all. And so therefore I found that that would be a case where you could test some of the arguments about how they change when it comes to justifying the one ban, which we have seen as really being effectively put into place.
Thanks. I start with the second question. So to say, the empirical scope of this paper is limited and ends somewhere in the 1920s. So it's very interesting, and I fully agree. I think we should see every technology and every artifact and the line of argumentation distinct. And I think there are really differences, and I'm very grateful that you point on that, because there is no general pattern, I would say. So the case of poison is not identical with the case of the atomic bomb. The case of aerial warfare also is not the very same. So there is always, you know, so to say, a big panorama of arguments, of scope, of ideas, who who is a victim, innocent victim, and who is a perpetrator, and which type of warfare is this, which type of military political conflict is that. And this promotes not only military ideas about military honor, but also certain types of morality which are enforced then by international law. So I'm very hesitant to generalize this. This is just, so to say, for the case what the international lawyers were talking, say, from the late 17th century until mid of the 1920s. And I was looking at their, so to say, labels of what is an irregular weapon, what should be forbidden, and how they justify that and what empirically came out. The other thing is, I would also, you're totally right, I should have mentioned Third World International Critical Approaches. The issue of colonialism and its impact on on the construction of international law is a bit disputed. Anthony Engie is a very prominent speaker, and he is very strongly making a claim that this is, so to say, the cornerstone of international law. And I would add that this is not only a dichotomy of the uncivilized and the civilized and the European of the non-Europeans. What I found very interesting is the grading, so to say. And this grading means that you have this idea of progress and civilization, and potentially everybody can be part of that. So the Spaniards were not looking at uncivilized, but sometimes on semi-civilized in the 16th century. And if you look at the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, Hutchison and Ferguson, how they perceived international society. So there are many shades of gray between the European nations and the others. And I think in this moment of World War I, so to say, these constructions with their inbuilt hierarchies and turn against the societies from which the European international lawyers, this invisible college, comes from. So I would say it's not only, it is more than a dichotomy of Western and colonial or center and periphery, but there are many, I mean, even if you look at the European continent, they had ideas about who are the superior Christians and the less, and it was very much disputed what is the status of the Ottoman Empire, what is the status of China, of Japan, and this changed a lot over time. So the assessment, for example, of China totally changed between, say, the middle of the 18th century, where China received a lot of estimation from international lawyers or natural lawyers like Christian Wolff, and in the end, Georg Jelinek is totally against China and says they are uncivilized and we are entitled to warfare and repression of them.
Very much. I'm on the interfering question, so we are going to your last chance.
Technological change, and do you think it's taken for granted that technological change and competition between states militarily leads to the universalization of these weapons in the legal literature? And as an aside, you mentioned in your talk the Congreve rocket, and this is quite an interesting case of reverse causality when it comes to Eurocentrism, because the British actually encountered the Mysorean rocket in the late 18th century and copied the technology, and they encountered it negatively and were defeated by the Mysoreans in several wars. But I was wondering, in the legal literature, is it just seen as almost a fact of the state of nature, even, that military technology once produced becomes universal, and then you need good governance or international legal orders in order to stop the spread of these weapons?
Depends on which epoch of international legal writing you look at. These textbooks about the law of nature and of nations were written in a very abstract manner. So very often they are not making explicit what their horizon, what their imagination is when they were talking about developments and banning things. So this is a very abstract discourse. It's also, the writings are, I think, also determined by path dependency. So they are very often repeating what the predecessors said in moral philosophy and theology and so on. And only, so to say, in the 19th century, they are getting more explicit and very often, typically in the footnotes. So they are making footnotes in new editions and explaining, but this is a very peripheral phenomenon. So very often you really can't guess what they are addressing, and they are, you know, they are jurists. They are not very much enthusiastic about being very concrete in the case of military technology law and saying such things. They are not having like evolutionary theories about the spread of technology. I wish they would. From my reading of sources, I can't say. Probably, I mean, the strongest sentiment was, you know, technology is bringing a bright future to us, and hopefully it will spread all over the earth. At least, I mean, for those who are civilized and in the hands of the right people, it's a real blessing. But this is more, you know, like making a theory out of very few remarks. For the interwar period and for the time of World War I, probably it's different, because, you know, at that time we have a lot of international legal journals which are only devoted to international law, and I would assume that the people writing in these journals are much more concrete, and they are making things more explicit in this situation of political and military pressure. But from here, I really can't say if they have something like a general philosophy of technology, if I may say so.
Thank you very much. First, let's thank Miloš for this really interesting presentation. And secondly, we have wine and cheese, so everything that was not said could be discussed in a personal. And secondly, if some of you have never been signing yourself to get the newsletter of the Institute, so you can know what kind of events, when Miloš is going to speak next, you can do it in the next room. So thank you very much for cheese and wine. Thank you very much, Miloš.